Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member from St. John South Mount Pearl for seconding this piece of legislation. And I also want to acknowledge the work that has been done by the member from Victoria and the member from Esquimalt-Wanda-Fuca. Now, what exactly is it that Bill C-638 does? What it does is it designates the Coast Guard as the receiver of REC for the purposes of the Canada Shipping Act, allowing them to take action without being directed to by a ministry. It will also compel the government to create regulations for the removal, disposition, or destruction of derelict vessels or wrecks. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've had a number of emails asking me exactly what do we mean by a wreck, and I'm going to go to Part 7 of the Canada Shipping Act, Section 153, and it says a wreck is defined as jetsam, flotsam, lagoon, and derelict and any other things that was part of or was on a vessel wrecked, stranded, or in distress. Now, Mr. Speaker, part of the reason that I've brought this bill forward is that what we have out there is a jurisdictional quagmire. We have 3 separate federal government departments who end up dealing with wrecks, whether it's transport, whether it's Environment Canada, or whether it's Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And then we've got provincial and municipal levels of government as well. And I want to quote from a report called Dealing with Problem Vessels and Structures in BC Waters. And in this report, it says dealing with problem vessels and structures can be highly complex due to the mix of provincial ownership of land, federal jurisdiction over navigation and shipping, and sometimes conflicting federal and provincial laws. Determining what laws apply can be complicated by the fact that provincial laws or local government bylaws that would be applicable to a structure or vehicle on dry land may not apply to vessels because they either conflict with federal laws, such as the Canada Shipping Act, or infringe on the core of the federal government's responsibility for navigation and shipping. And so, Mr. Speaker, you can see that what ends up happening, actually, and I'm going to give an example a little later on, is departments end up pointing their fingers at each other, or levels of government end up pointing their fingers at each other, and nobody takes responsibility. Now, you might ask, what is the scope of this problem? And unfortunately, what part of the problem is that we don't have a really good inventory of this, but there was some attempt in British Columbia to deal with the problems of derelict vessels. And there was a report called Vessels of Concern Inventory produced by Transport Canada, March 2014. And in this report, and it was only focused on British Columbia, and in this report it says a total of 245 vessels of concern have been identified in this inventory. And in my own riding, for example, the town of Ladysmith has 45 vessels. In south of me, the city of Victoria has 22 vessels, and so on. But there is a caveat in this report, and what they say is that the reader is cautioned that this inventory consolidates only the municipalities who responded. And so, Mr. Speaker, most people feel that the problem is seriously understated in British Columbia, and we know this is a problem from coast to coast to coast. And so we are hopeful that all members of this House will be seized of this issue and support what is really a first step. This is just a very preliminary first step. This Vessels of Concern inventory also indicated that many problem vessels of concern to local governments and the public are not obstructions to navigation, and therefore Transport Canada is unable to take direct action. And I want to point out this report was done by Transport Canada, and it does highlight part of the jurisdictional problems. Now, Mr. Speaker, before I get into some examples, I want to mention a couple of people who have worked on this issue for a number of years. And the first person is Loriani DiNardo, who is the regional director for the Cowichan Valley Regional District, who's responsible for Cowichan Bay. And unfortunately, Cowichan Bay, which is a lovely part of my riding, has had a number of problems with derelict vessels. And I have to acknowledge the former member, the former fisheries minister. He's from the East Coast, and one of the vessels broke loose and was floating around in high winds. And I went to the fisheries minister, and he immediately had the Coast Guard get that vessel secured and tied up. It didn't deal with the fact that this vessel was still in Cowichan Bay, but at least it was secured so that it wasn't running amok in the bay where there are many other vessels, including commercial vessels. I also want to acknowledge Sheila Malcolmson, the former chair of Islands Trust. And both Sheila and Laurie have been working on raising awareness and seeking solutions. And recently, Sheila Malcolmson sought and gained support from the town of Ladysmith and the Regional District of Nanaimo for my bill, C-638. In a 2013 letter to the Transport Minister, Sheila, as the Islands Chair Trust, highlighted the challenges facing our communities. The Islands Trust has been concerned with derelict and abandoned vessels for decades and has been asking since 2010 for the province of British Columbia and the federal government to develop a coordinated approach to the timely removal of all types of derelict and abandoned vessels, barges and docks. Although we're grateful for the leadership shown by Transport Canada staff in some specific derelict vessel removals last year, no permanent solutions have been adopted. Derelict and abandoned vessels, barges and docks pose environmental contamination and safety risks. They also create visual pollution in our communities, which negatively impacts tourism and commercial activities. The age of vessels in Canadian waters is increasing, and so the incidence of abandoned and derelict vessels is expected to increase and become unmanageable. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to give an example, a very recent example of how difficult this is for our communities to deal with. Just the other day, I wrote a letter to the Minister of Transport, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, and the Minister of Environment, highlighting a current situation. In that letter, I indicated on August 31st, 2012, I want to re-emphasize that, 2012. So we're talking 2.5 years later, we still haven't dealt with the problem. A survey was commissioned for the Canadian Coast Guard summarized that the Vicky Lynn, which is also known as the Aberdeen, it poses a significant, imminent, and ever-increasing threat to the environment due to her deteriorated condition and the significant amount of oil aboard. The survey recommended that the only certain way of removing this threat was to disassemble and scrap the vessel. Over 2 years later, the vessel still remains a threat. In the fall of 2014, 20,000 litres of oil was pumped from the Vicky Lynn 2 by the Coast Guard. However, 13,000 litres of oil and solvent remain on board. Unfortunately, the resources to remove the remainder of the material are limited. So, Mr. Speaker, this is part of the problem. If it's a hazard to navigation, Transport Canada will step in and secure the vessel. If the vessel is actually leaking oil into the water, Environment Canada will step in and do something. But the problem is, in this particular vessel's case, they pumped out the oil, they left all of this sludge in the bottom of the vessel, and the vessel was listing and threatened to sink, and in the Coast Guard's own assessment, the vessel was deteriorating. And yet that vessel sits there, and the community is waiting for it to sink, and then maybe somebody will step in and deal with a cleanup, which will probably cost hundreds of thousands of dollars more than if the vessel was removed from the bay. Now, on this issue, we have been working on this issue now for months. And in an email on February 6th, we wrote to the Transport Minister and said that the vessel appears to be listing, and given a forecast of lots of rain and possible high winds in the coming week, there is concern that the vessel could sink. Transport Minister wrote back to us saying, it was determined that the vessel is not now, nor would it likely become an obstruction to navigation in its current position. Therefore, the Navigation Protection Program has no mandate to intervene in this matter. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if the transport staff have actually been out to the West Coast where, guess what? We get big winds and big seas. And so we know it's not if this vessel sinks, it's when this vessel sinks. And the Transport Minister has known for years that this vessel is a problem, and yet there's no action. Now, it's not just about the environmental pollution. It's not just about it being a hazard to navigation. I want to read a letter from the Stumeenis First Nation, and they have also written a letter to the Minister of Transport saying, talking about the Vicky Lynn 2, or Aberdeen as it's known, that it will be an environmental disaster affecting the traditional waters of the Stumeenis First Nation, a vibrant and established shellfish industry, a growing marine tourism industry, BC's most successful West Purple martin recovery colony, and the very lifestyle of a region known for its connection to the sea. So Mr. Speaker, not only is it an environmental hazard, a hazard to navigation, but it also affects the very livelihood of the people who live in the area. And it's quite shocking to me that we cannot get any movement with regards to dealing what is a long-standing problem. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that there are numerous examples, and I wish I had time to go over all of the examples. As I said, there's 245 vessels that have been identified, and that doesn't even come close to representing the scope of the problem. But I don't have time to go over every vessel and the state it's in. But what we do have is concerns by the provincial government as well. And the provincial government and municipalities are urging the federal government to come to the table and to show leadership in tackling this problem. Now, I want to just mention one other vessel. Again, I don't have time to go through every one, but there was a vessel called the Trojan, which was adrift in Maple Bay, and this vessel was inadequately anchored. It didn't have enough rode. It didn't have a sufficient. It had a mooring attachment that wasn't sufficient for the size of the vessel, and again, it was a situation where we contacted Transport Canada, and because the vessel was temporarily secured and wasn't in the navigation channel at the time, Transport Canada said they couldn't touch it. And I understand from Transport Canada's perspective that that's their mandate. They can't really step in until it becomes a hazard to navigation. But in this case, because there was no environmental concern, Environment Canada couldn't step in either. So what happened on this particular case was we get some extreme tides on the West Coast. And so for a while, at low tide, it wasn't drifting around the bay. But as soon as we had some extreme high tides come, and guess what? This vessel was drifting around the bay. And so one of the constituents who had been involved in this said that the last word that I had from Transport Canada under the Navigation Protection Program is that they are considering their options. And so the constituent followed up and inquired about who had responsibility for removal and cleanup when, not if, the Trojan goes aground, and they didn't receive any reply. And the constituent goes on to say, of course, the problem with Transport Canada's response is that when the vessel becomes an obstruction to navigation again, or a danger to property again, it may be too late for remedial action. And in this case, it had actually damaged some private property when it had broken loose at some point. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've had a tremendous amount of support for this bill, and I want to remind people that this bill is only a first step. We are constrained in a private member's business about what we can ask for in a private member's bill and really what should happen. And I have to acknowledge that the Minister of Transport has been convening meetings that is discussing the Washington State model, which is probably a model that would be a good one for Canada to look at. But the Minister of Transport has been responding and acknowledging the depth of the problem. But in the meantime, what's happening is that municipalities and First Nations are actually rallying to support my bill because they recognize that it is at least some movement. And again, what it would do is designate the Coast Guard as a receiver of wrecks and require the government to set some regulations. Now, the town of Ladysmith has written a letter to the minister indicating support for this bill, and it says the problem continues to grow and poses an ever graver threat to our communities. Derelict and abandoned vessels leach many different environmental toxins into our waters, pose serious navigational hazards, and adversely affect both aesthetics and local economies. Local governments like ours are virtually powerless to address this issue which has such serious consequences for our communities. And just the other day, the Regional District of Nanaimo also supported Bill C-638, and the Regional District Directors voted unanimously at their regular meeting to write a letter of support for the private member's Bill C-638 that will see the Canadian Coast Guard take on full responsibility for derelict vessels littering the coastline. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And finally, this is not in my writing, but the Bowen Island municipality has also indicated its support because of the issues around environmental, economic, and navigational hazards posed by derelict and abandoned vessels. So Mr. Speaker, I'm hopeful that there will be support from all members in this House for this legislation as a good first step. And I think it's important when we take a look at not only the environment, hazards to navigation, but also the way that economic opportunities are also being impacted when we have derelict vessels that run aground or sink. So again, Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward to further debate on this bill, and I'm expecting to see it passed on to committee for further review. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions in